Good morning, everyone. I'm John Abbott, President and CEO of WGBH, and I would like to welcome you all, now that the rain has stopped, and to thank you for coming out today for this very special day that is a big part of our calendar each year. We hope that you'll find our annual Innovation IdeaLab a stimulating and inspiring experience. This is actually our 8th IdeaLab, a festival of ideas that comes to us all thanks to the generosity of the Kendeda Fund. And I want to thank them very, very much. IdeaLab is a forum that helps us find new voices, sometimes from far-flung corners of the country or the globe. It's also a time for us to seek new ideas for public media reporting, for grappling with big problems, and to hear from powerful visionaries and doers about approaches for solving them. Gathered here are our top WGBH editorial leaders, researchers, and reporters from Frontline, American Experience, and Nova, from our World Channel, PRI's The World, Innovation Hub, WGBH Radio, and PRX. And here are also our producers of children's programming and our educational media team, as well as independent producers of public media. And it's not in my remarks, but I'm more and more used to saying it this year in these times. I do want to not miss the occasion to observe that public media in this country is the last locally owned, operated, and governed media in this country. So your participation in this forum and your engagement with our makers, our producers, and our thinking about the stories that we'll share with our communities and our country are all the more important. Our audience includes also WGBH board members, foundation representatives, and friends and wonderful supporters of public media. Indeed, you're a room full of talented and engaged people. So I hope you'll take the opportunity during the breaks and lunch to meet one another, because the IdeaLab is fundamentally about making connections between engaged and interesting people and thinking about what that could mean for our future. Our theme this year is the Changemakers. Drawn from the far reaches of our country, today's speakers are people of courage and creativity. Most have given up opportunities for higher paying jobs and at considerable personal cost because they care deeply about making a better future for us all. Many are waging difficult struggles against formidable odds and over long spans of time, but not giving in to discouragement. Some have come from life experiences very different from our own, working in Florida's farm fields, or camping out for months at a time to protect a community water supply, or taking inner-city youth on a river trip to a pristine place. And finally, others are finding ways to make our communities greener, more inclusive, and more equitable. So today is a good day for intensive listening and gaining new perspectives, and we hope that you will leave inspired and also better connected to WGBH and our reporters and creators. I'm sorry to say that one of our veteran moderators, Kara Miller, unexpectedly couldn't be with us today, and I want to thank Heather Goldstone of Living Lab for being willing to cover the Future of Work session, which is one of the ones I know we're most looking forward to. But now, I'm grateful to turn it over to Miles O'Brien, who will lead us through much of the day, and we'll begin our first session, Saving Nature, Saving Ourselves. Thank you very much. Miles?
Thank you very much, John. The Changemakers. You know, ever since they demolished the toll booths on the Mass Pike, I've been wondering, where are the Changemakers? Here they are. You know, journalists like to think of themselves as change makers. I've been covering climate change in some fashion for the better part of 25 years. And we started off telling stories about, you know, went to Hudson Bay and we did polar bears that were emaciated sitting on an ice cube. We went to Kivalina on the North Slope, an island that's going to disappear very soon. Went to Tuvalu in the South Pacific, did all those stories. Nobody paid much attention. Then we did stories when Katrina happened. You know, were there links between cyclones and climate change? More recently, I've been doing a film for Nova on the links between wildfires and climate change. And all this time, you get the sense that people are just kind of in this state of denial or apathy or fear about climate change. But this morning, a piece of news that might change the equation. It appears that barley will become a little bit scarce in the world of climate change. Beer prices are going to go up. Maybe this will finally get people mobilized. Could this be the moment? I don't know. I'm hoping. I'm hoping it's beer. The truth is, as I did all those travels to the South Pacific and to the North Slope of Alaska and to the Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland, the people who live there, the people who are close to nature, they get it. They have a lot of skin in the game, after all. It's those of us whose contact with nature is beer are a little bit removed from this all. And so we begin our day with some people who have tried to pay close attention to those who are close to nature itself, who have been screaming and yelling for 25 years about what's happening. It's about time we listened and did more than just cry in our beer. Our first speaker is one of my personal heroes along the way. He has been writing early, often, and eloquently about the environment in general and about climate change as well. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, was really the seminal book for a wide audience about climate change. It's been published in 24 languages now. He's a founding fellow of the Sanders Institute, founder of 350.org, which is a grassroots effort to attack climate change, which apparently is the only way something is going to happen when it comes to climate change, given inaction we see at other levels. The Boston Globe has called him probably the most important environmentalist in our country, and we are very honored to have Bill McKibben here. Please give him a warm welcome.
Miles, thank you much. It is a pleasure to be with you all and a pleasure to be at WGBH. I'm so old that I was from the original, I watched Zoom when it was in its, not the remake, the original incarnation. I'm so old growing up in Boston that, Mr. Abbott, I can well remember your predecessor, David Ives, in his apron running the Channel 2 auction. So it's really fun to be back here. Linda, thank you for the invitation. This continues to be a thriving and important place. I get every few months get to go on the air with Jim and Marjorie and talk with them and sort of have some sense of the pulse of this place. And now, thank heaven, my daughter is at work here too, across the street helping run the podcast documentary for Frontline Dispatch. Their new season debuts in a week, which means she's much too busy to come hear her dad. But you should all listen to it because it's great. Very good idea to put me on first here, because you're going to get the really depressing and impossible stuff out of the way, and then you can go to work on the bright and cheerful ideas for remaking the world. I confess I really don't have those to give you right now. This is an extraordinarily difficult stretch of time for trying to think positively, at least about climate change. And I'll try to tell you why briefly and then tell you what, if anything, we can do about it. Probably most of you saw the coverage that came out of the IPCC report when it was published 2 weeks ago. This is essentially the same report that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been issuing since the mid-1990s. Every 5 years, the world scientists provide a new take on it, and it hasn't changed in any fundamental way. What's changed is that it's 25 years later, and we've done nothing, And so the slope that we must plummet down has become extraordinarily steep if we're to do anything about climate change. I see Bill Muma in the audience, who's almost the only person around who's worked as long on this issue as I have, and Tim Weiskell too. And one of the things I think all of us struggle to avoid doing is say from time to time, oh, if only you'd listened to us then. Because 30 years ago, there were actually a number of relatively gentle and easy trajectories out of this problem. Those are gone now. And if we're going to meet the mandates of physics, then we have no choice but to change with enormous speed. And of course, that's all the more difficult in a world where most of the political avenues for easy change are now closed off because of the people and parties that we've been putting in power, not just here, but increasingly around the globe. It's not in this case that we lack ideas about what to do. We know more or less what we need to do. We need to stop burning coal and gas and oil because the carbon that is emitted traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. We know now, in a way that we didn't 30 years ago, what we would replace those things with. The engineers have done their job with vengeance. We've watched over the last decade as the price of a solar panel has plummeted, dropped 90%. Now in most of the world, the cheapest way that you can generate electricity is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. Wind power, similarly. The cheapest electrons on Earth are coming from those spinning turbine blades. And so there is no technological barrier anymore. And there are people who have put these insights and others to work in all kinds of good ways. In the course of 10 minutes drinking coffee today, I was talking with people who are building passive house solar designs, people who are doing insulating and repairing commercial buildings to reduce their energy efficiency, to reduce their energy use. These things are not hard even at this point. They're things that we know how to do. And if we had 50 years or 75 years, then the natural and gradual evolution in those directions would take us where we need to go. Our problem, of course, is that we don't have 50 or 75 years. 50 or 75 years from now, the planet is going to run on solar power and wind energy because in the long run, free is a very difficult proposition to beat. Okay? Our problem is that on current trajectories, the world that we run on sun and wind in 50 or 75 years is going to be a fundamentally broken planet. And if we wanted to change that, if we wanted to make this happen more quickly, then we would need to change what we're doing now. Above all, we would need to figure out how to break the political power of the fossil fuel industry, the richest industry on Earth, and one that is clearly willing, in an effort to maintain its business model for another decade or two, to break the planet. And that's precisely what's going on. You've watched over the last few years this happen. We came out of Paris climate negotiations in December of 2015 with as close a claim to optimism as we've had during the global warming era. The agreement itself was not sufficient to deal with the problems that we faced, but it augured a certain momentum, and our hope was that we could build very quickly on it. And as the countries began the process of complying with the pledges they'd made in Paris, they would discover that it was easier and cheaper than they had thought, and we would be in a virtuous cycle that would speed this transition. Instead, what we've gotten is the exact opposite. In this country, the fossil fuel industry, fighting as they have for 30 years to defeat reality, managed to help elect a president who, as one of his first acts, withdrew the United Nations from those Paris Accords. The list of truly shameful and disgraceful things that we've done in this country over the last few years is long, but historians, I think, may treat that as just about the summit, that the country that's poured more carbon into the atmosphere than any other is now the only country on the planet that is unwilling to participate in the effort, international effort, to do anything about it should shame us all. We won't be alone in this for much longer. The man who was elected president of Brazil 36 hours ago has promised that that country too will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. Indeed, he has announced that he is removing all protections for land in the Amazon, the lungs of the planet, taking away the protections that have been granted indigenous communities to whom that land rightfully belongs. And that presages an assault on that forest whose continued operation we need if we're to have any hope of keeping the planet's climate under control. But you can see it in less spectacular things every day. I've been on the road for weeks now campaigning for candidates and ballot measures in the run-up to the midterm elections, and it's truly horrifying and disgusting to watch what's going on. I was in Washington State, where there is a modest carbon tax on the ballot, one supported by a broad measure of people, from frontline communities and communities of color in Washington to Bill Gates. And yet it's almost certain to go down to defeat because the fossil fuel industry has poured in tens of millions of dollars. BP alone spent $10 million to defeat this very modest carbon tax. I was in Colorado the next day, where people have asked not to ban fracking, merely on this ordinance to require people who are going to drill for oil to be more than a couple of thousand feet from people's homes and schools. That modest ask has so inflamed the fossil fuel industry that they've poured $38 million into the state. They're outspending the community groups that are fighting for this ballot measure 40 to 1. You cannot turn on the TV without, I mean, they've bought up every available piece of airtime. They've got so much money that they're reduced to driving trucks up and down the highways of Colorado, towing mobile billboards filled with their lies about this proposal. The question of how you manage to break the political power of that industry is the only interesting question that we have when it comes to climate change, the only unsolved question that we have. We understand the science of climate change. We understand most of the solutions that we need. We can talk about them all day, but it does no good to talk about them until we've broken that political power. And so that's what we try to do. History indicates that the only alternative currency to money that sometimes works is the currency of movements, of people coming together to build the kind of movements large enough to, in the end, shift the zeitgeist of the planet. And if one can shift the zeitgeist, then one perhaps can change the politics in time to begin to catch up the physics. So that's what we try to do. 350.org, which we founded a decade ago, we've now organized about 20,000 demonstrations in every corner of the world except North Korea. We've involved religious communities in a huge way for the first time in this work. That's just to give you an example. That's Jordan and Palestine and Israel on the same day, with people coming together around the edges of the Dead Sea, which has shrunk alarmingly as the temperature has warmed. Those are your brothers and sisters in the Maldives, in the Indian Ocean, holding their meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate the existential problem that faces parts of the world where people live only a few meters above sea level. We have done this in every way that we can think of to do. 350 is the safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million, a number sadly we're already way north of. 410 parts per million today and going up about 3 parts per million per year. That's why the Arctic is melting. That's why our great forests now catch on fire with regularity. That's why we see droughts like we've never seen before. That's why we see temperatures that we've never seen before. 2018 was the warmest summer in human history. Place after place managed to set all-time heat records. We think the highest reliably recorded temperatures ever measured on planet Earth. There were cities last summer where for days the temperature topped 129 degrees Fahrenheit, really past the point where humans over the long term have any business living and surviving. And so we do this over and over again, and I can show you these pictures all day and all night, and it's been wonderful and powerful and built great alliances, and we're at the point where we should be making, that's one of those dry riverbeds in the Southwest. We hired a satellite one day to do these great art projects around the planet. They called it the biggest day of art in the planet's history. When the satellite came over Santa Fe, 2,000 or 3,000 people organized by the Santa Fe Art Institute put blue blankets over her head just to bring that river back to life for a second, okay? In a rational world, perhaps all this would be enough, but that's not the world in which we live, so we now engage in all kinds of other actions. These are a few shots from the beginning of the fight against the Keystone Pipeline. You're going to hear from one of the great activists in the planet in a minute, Tara Houska, who's going to tell you about some of these other fights that are underway that draw on and are similar to this work, and they happen everywhere. There's not a pipeline, there's not a coal mine, there's not a frack well on the planet now that isn't fought and contested, and we win some of these fights and we lose some, but the overall work is powerful and impressive. But whether it's happening in time or not, I can't begin to tell you, because so much of the time now we're seeing the effects just kind of overwhelm us. These are our colleagues up in Siberia. You know, we're now seeing forest fires routinely 4 and 5 degrees of latitude north of where we ever saw them before, because the forests have become so hot and dried out. These are people who are leaving their homes in Micronesia, forced to evacuate because the water has risen too high. These are people in the part of Pakistan that had the greatest flood since Noah in 2010, when the Indus, after record rainfall, overflowed to the point that 1/4 of the country was underwater and 20 million people had to evacuate their homes. And if you look at them for a second, you're privy to the other great truth of climate change, which is the people who have done the least to cause it are the ones who get hit first and hardest, okay? I'm going to leave you, let's see if I can, well, there's a picture that always is powerful to me. It's a tiny little demonstration in a tiny provincial corner of Haiti, but what gets me is what the signs that those kids are holding say. Your actions affect me, which is absolutely true. That town done next year, that city, Lake Hay, was wiped off the face of the map by a hurricane. 80% of its housing stock destroyed. I have no idea if those kids are still alive. Your actions affect me, but not vice versa. There's really not much that people in Haiti can do to affect the outcome of this story. They can't burn less fossil fuel because they're not burning any now, and they can't go to the White House and sit in because we don't let people into this country for purposes like that, and they can't do things like divest their holdings in fossil fuel because they don't have any. It's places like this that have any, and it's why it should make us absolutely sick that institutions like, say, Harvard College down the road with the biggest endowment of any institution on earth refuses to, continues to buy stock in fossil fuel companies and defend the status quo. All their protestations to the side. So people now fight and fight everywhere, and it's been beautiful to be a part of that fight and get to see it up close, to see the fact that indigenous communities and frontline communities are leading it and doing the most powerful work and doing it in every part of the planet. These are our brothers and sisters in the South Pacific, in islands like Tuvalu, the Marshalls, Micronesia, the Solomons, Vanuatu, that may not make it out of this century. But their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And it's beautiful to watch that. 2 years, 3 years ago, each of those countries built a traditional canoe, and they took them off to Newcastle in Australia, and they used them to blockade the largest coal port in the world for a day. And the pictures that come back should give you some sense of what this fight looks like, literally looks like. What it looks like, and this is a trope that fits well in human brains, is the fight of the small and the many against the big and the few. This is the rebel alliance against the Death Star, okay, quite literally. And it is a picture we see and an image we see repeated around the world. That was the same summer in Seattle. That big 40-story drilling rig over there was one that Shell wanted to take into the Arctic to start drilling for oil in the American Arctic for the first time. Think about that for a minute. The world's climate scientists had told us that if we kept doing what we were doing, we would melt the Arctic. Indeed, they turned out to be correct. Did groups like Shell Oil look at that and think, maybe we should go into the solar panel business instead? They did not. They looked at that and said, now it'll be easier to drill for more oil in the Arctic. That makes one wonder whether the human brain was a good adaptation or not, I think. Happily, there were plenty of people with big brains connected to big hearts that were willing to get in the way. Thousands of people in small craft took to the harbor. We called them kayaktivists. And before the summer was done, Shell decided it couldn't sustain the brand damage that was underway and pulled out of its plans to drill in the Arctic. Although people are headed back into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge next week to begin the process of prospecting for oil. We need, so this is where I end, just to say there is no magic idea. There's no great solution beyond the solution of people figuring out how to stand up to the brute power that is represented by the concentration of money in the fossil fuel industry. If we cannot do that, then we cannot win this fight. There is nothing that individuals can do as individuals at this point. My house is covered with solar panels. I'm happy for it, but I do not try to fool myself that it is doing anything to end climate change. The only thing that will is if individuals figure out how to become somewhat less individual and join together in movements large enough to change the basic zeitgeist on this planet. It's the biggest challenge that humans have ever come up against. So far, we are failing that challenge. Let's hope that people like Tara will be able to figure out how to move us through into the next phase. Thank you very much.
Let's, the perfect segue to our next guest, who is a tribal attorney. She advocates on behalf of tribal nations and has spent at least 6 months on the front lines in North Dakota, battling the pipeline there, heavily engaged in the movement to defund fossil fuels, and has fought several pipelines all over the place. Please welcome Tara Houska.
Well, climate change is a fun thing to talk about, isn't it? Buju Tara Indishna Jagana Shimang Minua Shaboy Kwe Indishna Kazanishnamimang Makwan Dudame Couchiching and Dunshaba. My name is Tara Houska. I am Bear Clan from Couchiching First Nation. I was born and raised in International Falls, Minnesota, and I think it's important to recognize where we're at right now. We're on the Wampanoag people's land. It's good to always think about those things, not just in representation and recognition of Indigenous people, but so we would connect to the land. I thought that it would be good for all of us sitting in this room as we're looking at this stage and looking at all these lights and looking at each other, probably having flown from somewhere, to just take a moment and think of your grandparents' faces, at least one grandparent. Maybe they're gone, maybe they're not here anymore. But think about that. Think about a grandchild. If you don't have a grandchild, think about your child. If you don't have a child, think about your nephew, your niece. I'm sure you have somebody in that next generation. I think that we'd be so much better off as people if we were able to consciously think of ourselves like that in this line of people that has been here since the time that we began, really. For the way that I know and the way that I've been taught, I stand in a line of people that came before me and those who come after. It's just one small link, one little moment in time, And so many of us, I think, have forgotten that as we've tried so hard to hang on to our titles and our power and our belief in what we're doing, as the world around us is literally on fire, right? I mean, that's what we are looking at. So I wanted to start with this. I show this to bankers all of the time, but I'll show this to you guys. A little bit different. I'll be a little bit nicer than I am normally to bankers. Mother Earth has been abused. The powers have been abused. This cannot go on forever. No theory can alter the simple fact that Mother Earth will retaliate. The whole environment will retaliate, and the abusers will be eliminated. Things come full circle back to where they started. That's Revolution by Russell Means. So if you want to move to the next one. I have a clicker, don't I? Great. All right, so I got to spend 6 months of my life out in North Dakota standing with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and then Lakota and Dakota people out that way trying to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. I left from DC and I was living the same life that many other folks were in DC. So in a law office, representing tribal nations all over the country. And I saw this happening, and it was a multifaceted kind of reaction for me. It was, this is it. We're finally standing up. It was, we're sick of the status quo. We're sick of the marches. We're sick of the rallies. We're sick of, having these people tell us what they're going to do with our land. 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is held by indigenous people. 80%. We have not lost these connections. And so here is Dakota Access Pipeline by Energy Transfer Partners saying, well, we're actually not going to put we're not going to put our pipeline through Bismarck, North Dakota, because there's drinking water concerns here, but we're going to put it right next to the reservation because our people matter, but yours don't. And it was this moment of no, again and again and again we say no, but you move forward. And so for me, it was this call to action that was heard by thousands of people around the country and the world, and then by millions, and it was this moment of watching Obama get questioned in Laos by a student about the Dakota Access Pipeline, having no idea what that was. That's the power of community organizing. So this is, at the top here, this is when they were using water cannons on us and sub-freezing temperatures. Bill mentioned the divestment efforts. So, we were in this situation of, being out in this place and being physically blockaded in. I will say a positive of that is there was a physical blockade, and some folks may know who Sophia Wilansky is. She is a woman who almost had her arm blown off by a concussion grenade that was launched at her by police officers. Because of the blockade that they put in place, she had to spend an extra hour and a half in an ambulance to get to the hospital. She's 21 years old and has lost 80% of her arm function, but her lawsuit was just approved against the state, and against the company and against all of them. So we'll see what happens with that for being put in that position. But for us, for the rest of us, there's all these human rights abuses that were happening, but it was also, what do we do? We're physically blockaded and we can't go stand in front of the pipeline being construction anymore. So what do we do? We started looking at the money, and there was all these people asking us, what do we do? How can we help? We can't get to North Dakota. I can't physically get there. So the money has been incredibly successful to the tune of trillions of dollars. It's watching them recognize that this situation that happened in North Dakota was eye-opening. I think it should be eye-opening for every American citizen looking at, this is America, we have rights. But no, when it comes down to it, I watched a corporation directly running the scenes of law enforcement, running the scenes of our National Guard, telling the governor what to do, saying, no, I want these people arrested. I don't care about their constitutional protections. I don't care about their constitutional rights. I'm going to arrest Indigenous people for trespassing. You know, I'm an Indigenous person. I was arrested for trespass. It's a fascinating concept. You know, so now I'm looking at, you know, I'm actually personally coming today along with another water protector in the audience, Malia Hulaman, who came out from Hawaii to stand with us. I'm coming from a resistance camp in northern Minnesota, where we are fighting the Enbridge Line 3 line. You know, I think there's a misunderstanding, and maybe it's almost our own defense mechanisms of, you know, not just frontlines resistance, but, you know, why pipelines? We should do these high-level policy. You know, we've got to solve it from the top. We have to do it from the top. The top is not working. You know, we're watching what happens with the top. It's like, oh, we get this Paris Accord, and we finally get everyone to say climate change, but they're not going to bind themselves to it, right? And then right away, as soon as the Trump gets in, I mean, Trump to me is actually not surprising. As an Indigenous person watching what's happening in this country, he's a symptom of the problem that's been underlying for a very long time. And I also appreciate, actually, that he is a great killer of apathy. And watching all of these people come out and march and do all of these amazing things. But, you know, you watch something like that and you look at Trump, of course, is going to pull out immediately, and that's exactly what he tried to do. He's going to, you know, do everything in his power to dismantle the EPA. When I was in DC, my first internship was in Obama's Council on Environmental Quality. I watched Trump just a few weeks ago trying to undo that executive office, which is in charge of the National Environmental Policy Act. I mean, that's, you know, one of the only executive offices that actually has authority over a statute and can enforce. And he tried to get rid of it, but it lived. But yeah, so I mean, looking at that, you know, it's always this top-down focus and top-down organizing. But you know, I think that we're in a time where we all should recognize how urgent the situation is. It is incredibly urgent. And these folks that are doing these things are not doing them lightly. It's not just raging against the machine. It's not just, I'm really angry and upset. Although, you know, honestly, a lot of these people are pretty angry and upset. I think Indigenous people in this country are pretty pissed off for pretty good reasons. You know, it's this systemic oppression and dismantling, while at the same time us being the people who are on the front lines trying to protect the water for all of us. You know, we are the last defenders. This way of life is something that is incredibly important and beautiful to us, but it's something I think that so many of us should reconnect with. In northern Minnesota, we're looking at, this is my teacher pay bomb, harvesting wild rice. Wild rice is a grain. It's a superfood that is sacred to my people. It is at the heart of who we are as people. The Creator told us to go west from the East Coast, from over here actually, to find where the food grew on water. And so it's actually written in our treaty rights. And so, you know, you walk this difficult path of both being a traditional Indigenous person, of understanding the land, of understanding the water and the connections with it. But then how do I explain this and translate this to a world that is so hung up on, you know, the policy and the law and all of these different things, right? And so you engage in forums like, I'm going to go to law school and I'm going to learn how to do this and talk about these things in this language. You know, I'm gonna talk to the bankers in their language. I'm going to not only bring my, you know, my quote unquote sad story and what's happening in my backyard, but I'm also going to bring it with legal rights and say, if you don't do these things, we're going to sue you. You know, and then we watch the companies, the Enbridges and the TransCanadas and the Energy Transfer Partners, who are incredibly, incredibly upset. They have their conferences too, you know, and they're saying things like, I can't stand how these protesters are hiring these high-powered lawyers to engage in the regulatory processes, you know. And I'm like, good, you know, that's great. I'm glad to see that you guys are upset with us. But saying things in the next breath of, we need to work really closely with our regulators to make sure our processes and our regulations work as they're supposed to approve our projects. You know, that should tell us where we're at politically. Bill, you referenced it. It's spot on. I mean, politically, we are not shifting this conversation. Politically, we're seeing Democrats who are doing the exact same things environmentally as Republicans, you know, and that's like their first bargaining chip is, well, I mean, yeah, okay, I get it. People are pretty upset about climate change, but we'll do some other things over here, you know, and we'll save these you know, social programs, hopefully, but we'll give up on climate change because it's not popular. It's not a popular issue. No, the destruction of the planet is not a popular issue. You know, the literal survival of our children is not something that most people like to think about, but it's something that I hope literally all of us are thinking about. You know, and concerning these laws, you know, one thing I've learned through all of this, you know, of working in so many different forms and avenues of change is, you know, you have to really pay attention to what's going on, to the side details. You know, there's these side details. So the Indian Child Welfare Act is a law that protects Indigenous people from removal from home. That's what it was intended for. There was all these Indian children being taken out of the home, sent to residential schools. This was a government-sanctioned program. And yeah, it's a terrible thing. But within the Indian Child Welfare Act, there's this piece of it that talks about Indigenous identity. And so all these well-funded people have been pursuing the dismantling of this law for a very long time, for decades and decades. And just recently, last month, a federal court in Texas agreed that the provisions within the Indian Child Welfare Act were racist, that Indigenous people are not actually different people. And so the implications for that, for us, for our work in the environmental movement, are huge. You're talking about Indigenous people, the entire body of federal Indian law and our rights being dismantled. You're talking about treaties being completely disregarded because we no longer exist as people. That's happening here in Massachusetts. The Wampanoag people were just, their lands were just taken out of trust because they are no longer federally recognized. They're not considered Indigenous people any longer. These are the people that met the Pilgrims, right? So that's what we're seeing. It's important to kind of always be vigilant, you know, and to also look and listen to what's happening. We're the people that are on the front lines, right? We're the people that are on the ground looking at what's happening throughout our country and throughout our world. And so when we tell you, you know, as a movement, this is what's happening and this is what we need, I hope that message is being heard. You know, it's knowing that right there at the top, I mean, that happened across the bay from my home in Duluth, Minnesota. This is Superior. The tar sands refinery exploded and we were evacuated. They later told us the next day, within 12 hours actually, it took less than 24 hours, within 12 hours they were saying that it was just precautionary, that everything was fine, that the ground was fine, it rained, so the plume was out of the air and it was all good. That's what they told us, you know, and I'm like, okay, well, my lungs were burning and my eyes were burning, and now they're being sued in a class action, which is great. We saw that these tanks right here, there's actually a hydrofluoride tank just past this. The fires that raged that day got within 200 yards of that tank, and if it had blown, it would have killed 180,000 people. That's what's happening, but yet we allow and continue this conversation of, you know, the baseline for so many of these projects and so many of the infrastructure and expansion of the industry, because that's really what I'm, and a lot of people are focused on, is stopping at least the expansion. You know, if we can at least do that, we should not be doing that. We should not be allowing the industry to expand at a minimum. I mean, we're already operating way past our carbon footprint, right? But when we look at them, you know, we're saying, how is your baseline? I need this. How is the baseline? This project is going to happen, so how is it going to happen? You know what I mean? What's the safest place? Where should we put it? Where is it going to be out of sight, out of mind? You know, all these things. And so you look at corporate accountability and you say, okay, well, I'm coming to you as a pipeline company and you have a climate change policy, which is very fascinating. I'm coming to you as a banking institution, you have a climate change policy. Why are you not following it? You know, there are things that we can do. I do think the situation is very dire, and it is very, very difficult to maintain, you know, hope. But you look at the people who are willing to do these things and take these risks, and you understand that, I hope that we can all collectively understand as an environmental movement that those people who are taking those risks and that are willing to go to that level to be arrested and risk their personal freedoms, those changes are felt. They're ripples that are felt all the way through the industry. If it weren't for the human rights abuses that happened at Standing Rock, we wouldn't have been able to push the divestment movement as hard as we did by bringing it to Norway, by bringing it to countries that have human rights policies and laws in place and say, this is what happened. This is what you're funding. And it wouldn't have caused the type of pressure on insurers when we go to insurers and we go to credit rating agencies and we go to all these different folks, all these different actors, trying to talk to them in the language of money, but using the people's will at the base. It's the people's will. We're all so comfortable. And I think that, as a movement, we should not be. We should not be just kind of like almost in the same defense mode as them, We're in this defense mode of, well, I mean, they're not going to win, I mean, they're out there, but who's really going to do that? I mean, that's, I guess I'll send them some money. No, we should actually be really trying our absolute best to empower and to engage with frontlines resistance and with what's happening with our youth. We should be listening, and this is literally their planet, right? I mean, we've done more than enough damage. This on the left is where I come from, and on the right, this is Lake Superior. This is where the Enbridge Line 3 terminal wants to end and send it out on tankers for foreign export. So you look at these places and you think, well, these are not places that I guess I maybe see a lot, but these are places that hold a fifth of the world's fresh water, literally a fifth of the world's fresh water. There's so much more that we can do when we stand together. We have been able to successfully, get Energy East taken off the map. We have pushed so hard that Kinder Morgan, had this kind of resistance that was felt all the way to the highest levels of the government and forced even Justin Trudeau, our former climate change champion, to purchase a pipeline, outright. I mean, that is really forcing social change and exposure, too, of what's happening for a broader audience. In Minnesota, we watched the Sandpiper Project go down, and I think that we can defeat Keystone XL again. I hope that this is the last time. It would be nice if it was the last time. I'm tired of talking about that pipeline. I think that, in terms of hope, we have a lot of people already in these movements. We are always marching and rallying, and at some point I've, begun to wonder, like, who is it really for? Yes, I want to bring in new voices and I want to bring in new people, but we already have a lot of people. We have so many people and so many voices that are all trying to think of solutions together. I think it's important and critical that we stand together and that we be brave. We have to be brave. We have to be brave for our children. We have to be brave for our planet. I think that we can. Hello, Gwitch.
Thank you, Tara. So I guess it's worth talking a little bit about the value of what we are protecting. We're not only trying to save our own skins, we're thinking about nature itself. And our next speaker will take us on a really fascinating story that begins with Desert Storm, takes us through Somalia, leads us to a personal struggle with PTSD, and ultimately a fascinating program that brings veterans and troubled youth together. And a river literally runs through it. Please welcome Chad Brown and Axe.
Thank you. My name is Chad Brown, and I'm the founder and president of Soul River Inc., a nonprofit organization that uses fly fishing and the outdoor exploration to bring veterans and youth together. The camaraderie and peace experience on the river is something that's been important in my life. Fly fishing has helped me in my ongoing struggle with PTSD. My experiences in the Navy has left me in dark places, but being in the outdoors has been healing. The healing is something I have to share with others. Inner city youth and veterans often deal with unspoken trauma. Through Soul River, they discover their own resilience. In a new context, their life can be about something else, starting on the river. Deployments partner youth with veterans who act as mentors. Throughout the deployments, the veterans have a clear purpose. These are tough deployments, often exhausting and requiring everyone to be on high alert. You work together for the success of the group, and that is important learning. Working side by side, everyone is inspired to be a good leader and a good teammate. Everyone involved understands what it means to be under threat, and with that common understanding, the healing happens. Experiencing these wild spaces inspires our youth to become advocates for conservation.
Awesome. Pretty stoked to be here, and it's always an interesting opportunity to share my story and how I got here and the aftermath of the organization that I founded. It's a little bit about what happened before my organization. I am a combat vet, Navy veteran, served in Desert Storm, Operation Store Hope, Somalia, been in 14 different countries. As long as I stayed in the United States was 4 months, my entire Navy stint. Coming out of that, I found myself going back to college, finish off with my master's, and coming out of that, I ended up going into the work world, and that was when a lot of things started to happen with me. I started to lose focus, losing my direction. Over a course of time, I found myself becoming homeless, and I lost everything. Lived on the streets for 12 months, and the way my survival was, basically, I was finding myself in places that, around people that you probably wouldn't consider in your own society, but I was down in the lows in the bloodlines, giving blood, trying to make $20 for a pint of blood to put in my gas tank while I was living out of my truck. Dumpster diving was kind of like another line of survival tactics that I needed to adopt to keep myself from crossing that line, just like vets, committing some type of crime. And I was really, really strong borderline through that whole process. A person found me and took me to the VA hospital, and I really wasn't that much really keen about going to the hospital, but I found myself going there, and I started getting thrown with a lot of bags of brown medication, basically, brown bags of medication. And I was popping pills left and right, trying to keep myself awake, trying to keep myself from fighting my demons, trying to keep myself from having flashbacks. I got to a point where I was pretty much a walking zombie, where I couldn't even smile when the sun hit me in my face. Sooner or later, I found myself on the river about to take my life. I was strung out on heavy medication so much that when I drew my weapon, I couldn't even hold it. I actually collapsed and fainted, and was found by a cop that found out that I was a veteran, and took me to the hospital, to the VA hospital, in the psych ward for 8 days straight. My name became my last 4 digits of my social security number, and proving to the docs that I was not gonna hurt myself. And I convinced the docs I was gonna hurt myself. I ended up walking out. A friend took me to the river one day and showed me how to fly fish, to fast forward. When I got out there, I didn't really know anything about fly fishing, but my friend said, this is where I used to come to when I was dealing with my divorce and going through my hardships, et cetera. I'll come to the river. And so they took me to the river, didn't know, and they took me to the shop and found me a rod and reel, and I started to fish and hooked into my first salmon, and I started going hoorah all over the place. And it was a time that I felt that the ooze of all that medication was coming out of my pores. You know, it was my happiness, my moment, my time, just to know what it feels like the sun is hitting my face. you know, and I made that connection to nature, and that was kind of like my pivot right there. I went back to the VA and told my doc this is what I wanted to do. And what I want to do is I wanted to wing off these meds. I want to use fly fishing as my way of getting back into society and getting my head straight. The docs got behind me, weaned me off the meds slowly, and ended up getting stronger mentally. Got good at the sport, and I ended up getting picked up by a couple companies, competing in the pro circuit basically, and fly fishing, and it was my world, it was my life. Sooner or later, as I was getting stronger and getting a little bit much more confident, basically, I just got really strong there. I just wanted to get back into society. They started fighting a lot of my VA paperwork, et cetera. That came through, and that was when I basically decided to make the connections of putting vets and youth together, where vets are fighting for their purpose in life, and youth are giving vets that opportunity to get that purpose, and we're giving those youth basically a lifetime of big brother, big sister mentoring in the outdoors. And so my idea started to grow much more stronger, you know, and I got my VA benefits from the VA. I took my money, which was a little bit close to 7 years of back pay of medical in the hospital, and I self-invested into my idea. And it was right at the time that Obama was talking about getting every kid into the outdoors, et cetera. And what I was doing basically, it was going back to at-risk youth of urban communities that are disconnected, and for whatever barrier that they have in their life of getting to the outdoors, whether that's gear, transportation, et cetera, I was going to step in and I would basically make that zero cost. Same thing for veterans. I basically bring these two worlds together where we do these what we call expeditions. You call them expedition out, and we call them deployments. How do we find the deployments? And what I do is I look throughout the United States of areas that are at threat. And what's at threat, we turn those areas into a curriculum. And that curriculum basically takes in all the negative issues that are happening in that environment, whether that's wildlife or environmental. And we put that in curriculum, and we bring it into an awareness piece where veterans step up and they use this curriculum in the outdoors to help engage our youth and bring them to Leaders for Tomorrow. These deployments goes all over the United States. I also partner with indigenous communities, the Couchiching, the Navajo as well, Bears Ears. We've done 4 deployments up into the Arctic Circle. These deployments are really intense and are pretty much they're off the grid. They cover outdoor leadership, they cover conservation awareness, and also advocacy. I partner with various conservation groups. These conservation groups that comes into the fold behind my organization, pretty much as secret partners, I call them. The secret partner steps in when we come back from the deployments. The conservation group steps in and helps engage our youth on an advocacy one-on-one level. They also help build the bridges and the logistics to make their way from Portland, Oregon into Washington, D.C. and help open congressional meetings for youth to be able to come in and share their stories and for them to know what it's like to carry the weight and the concern of a leader of our communities, basically. And this is all guided by veterans, and they step in as well. It's like a biblical thing of when you see these 2 demographics connect in the outdoors, it's like an iron sharpened iron type of process. You know, and I always say you have a youth that comes from many different backgrounds, and they're young warriors. They're fighting for their voice. They're fighting for a strong platform. They're fighting to be seen just as much as a veteran is trying to fight to be seen, heard in our society, basically. They're also fighting through their demons, and same thing with the veterans fighting through their demons. You put these 2 warriors together, basically, and they start this iron sharpening iron process in the most pristine threat environments throughout the United States. When these 2 pieces come together, you start seeing the layers break down. the layers break down, and I'm out there also with counselors on standby. First, we got to work through the demons before we can even work through to create leaders for tomorrow. And we on the field, we're working through the demons. It's the real stuff that we deal with in the outdoors, and it's a fight. It's literally a fight within itself. Once we work through that piece, that's when you start to see the unravelness of the ideas start to come up, and these youth are pretty freaking amazing. 14-year-old kids that comes through our program, they're treated as brothers and sisters. It's like a tribe. It's interesting that when you see a lot of us vets comes back from the war, we look at our brothers and sisters and we get them. It doesn't matter which branch that we serve. That same type of idea and concept and that same connection is what we find in our youth. Our youth are raised up really fast. The number 14, that number is just a number. It stops at the door. They become our sisters and our brothers. And they also become a really strong platform. A lot of our youth becomes leaders really, really fast. And they have, we have youth that's working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife now. We have youth that's went off to shadow NOAA as well, and internships, science programs. It's pretty amazing on what the veterans actually steps up and do. We're also supported by volunteers that comes into a place where volunteers come from many backgrounds like science, education, et cetera, and we use them as well as an extension of the veterans to help educate our youth for tomorrow. At the end, well, I think I have another film to show.
Many of us that come out here and spend time out here, you come away a stronger person, and hopefully the value of having a place like this can be passed on.
Probably peek, and then they'll see it's a bunch of people. Yeah, they're out there.
We're about to start a Waders Olympics right now. And this is when all the veterans kind of do a boot camp style and run them through kind of like an obstacle course that's relating to fishing, where they put their rods together, their waders and the boots on and everything like that. Let's go, let's hurry up. Let's get your waders on, please. Hurry up, let's go.
Yeah. The one place I expected to escape water. As soon as I get that gold medal, I'm gonna bite it.
On your mark, get set, go! Let's go, let's go, let's go! Let's go! Come on!
Okay. All right, let's go! Let's go! All right, Riley, I have utter confidence in you. Unzip it! Let's get that dog! Come on! Let's go! What? Talk about it! Go! We've been training for 7 years, you know, and like team chemistry is key. One time.
You know, we're pretty early into the deployment still. These kids are really special, and the kids that I've participated in these deployments with before, it's a hell of a thing to be looked up to by them. It's an honor, absolutely.
This is the fly line.
Matthew, he seems like a big brother. He's someone that you can talk to easily. He's someone that you can rely on. He's someone that will be there to cheer you up in any way that he can. I know that he was in Afghanistan. Whenever he talks about those things, he goes into this place.
And the longer the line gets hit, exactly, let's keep going.
At the age of 18, straight out of high school, I joined the U.S. Army. I served 5 years. Spent one of those years in Afghanistan, 2010 to 2011. It was a normal day. We're out before the sun was up. The last thing I remember was taking a picture of these two kids right in front of me. And
it changed him, obviously. The concussion of it was severe enough to leave him stricken with a severe TBI. Watching him out here kind of turn into a kid again, and like I had said about finding meaning and purpose and community in that tribe, I see that within him out here, and it's like everything that's happened or happens on these deployments. It's very special and rewarding to see that kind of healing going on.
With Matthew especially, he reminds me exactly of my uncle because he's loving, kind, and strong. As long as I've known him, he's been my role model and a male figure I always looked up to. It's kind of hard to put it into words how the relationship is because it's just such a connection I thought I would never be able to make again.
It's something that's actually making an impact. You make bonds with people that you never thought you would, and it's hard to let them go. There's a joke that we laugh about now, but it was a little emotional. I asked all the youth, I was like, it might sound weird, but am I the only one that feels like I need you? Like I feel somewhat lost or empty without having you all there. And then there was a little bit of silence, and then we were like, yeah.
Once you step on the river, you don't think of anything. You just think about that moment. You don't think about the drama or problems in life that's going on. I feel normal again. That's what happens when I'm out here on trips with Soul River.
The power of fly fishing, it changed my life. It's changing these kids' lives. It's changing veterans' lives. And it's just something to see, to believe.
Before I step down, I just want to share with you that this was our deployment that we did last year. It was a 180-mile float with youth and veterans through the Arctic Circle on the north slope of the Brooks Range on the the Chandelar. And the whole purpose of going up there is not a trip. It's actually going up there, giving youth an opportunity to see ground zero about climate change, basically. They're tasked to maintain scientific journals and throughout the entire process. And they're also tasked to do their own research. They do their own research and they get tasked. One will be doing research on environmental issues, one will be on wildlife, one will be on the water, the river, entomology, the fish, etc. And then they would actually turn those pieces basically into their own curriculum and teach the youth themselves and also teach veterans. And we're constantly doing this back and forth, So through this whole process, it's really short. You're not able to see everything, but these are kind of like a little snapshot of what our deployments are: self-sustained, off the grid. The youth are kind of thrown in there to where they're actually trained by veterans. They learn, we're living amongst each other, etc. I have actually a 85% turnout of young women that comes through our program. Also is mixed, and we also capture the LGBTQ community as well as veterans as well on these deployments. So they're pretty enriched, interesting deployments, and we end our journey at Benetai with the Couchiching folks and Couchiching Nation. They came in and they basically added a cultural, historical piece to the Arctic folks who don't know, the Couchiching, they're the Caribou people, and so they kind of downloaded a lot of information for the youth and for the vets. I just came back from the Venetai this year on another deployment to where we do a Mission Forward project. On these Mission Forward projects, it's like a Peace Corps style. And we go in and we start to basically sit down with the tribal leaders, and we're not there to save the community. That's not the idea. What the idea is to define what a project that we can do to get our hands into the dirt. I really believe that in making strong advocates for tomorrow, we got to get away and actually create community by getting a little bit dirty in building, or getting into the mix and merging ourselves into the culture and understanding what's going on, et cetera, from a land perspective and a wildlife perspective, from the people of the land. You know, and so the Couchiching folks, they're able to open the doors, and one of the projects that we did when we were up there was putting together a community garden that was dismantled since the 1950s. And so I tasked the veterans and the youth, we broke into teams, and we built this community garden, where this community garden became kind of like this pivot magnet piece for a community to rebuild itself, where veterans, Couchiching, youth are all working together to build this community garden, and it became like a beacon for tomorrow. And it was a pretty amazing experience. And that's it, folks. I just want to share. So.
All right, thank you, Chad. Well, thank you, Chad. If you ever doubted the healing power of nature, go talk to Chad. I think we should have our. Can you get every member of Congress out in that river? That might be a good idea. Might solve a lot of problems right there, actually. You know, I was talking about polar bears earlier, and how in the early days when I was doing climate change stories for CNN, I couldn't sell them if there wasn't a sad polar bear in the mix. And our next speaker thinks a lot about that, and the almost cartoonish way we view nature and animals. If they're cute and furry, we love them and want to protect them, and if they're not, maybe we don't care so much. It doesn't really reflect the nuance of nature and perhaps the importance of things that are less cute to us. For her, this began with the, I would say, somewhat lovable sloth. She's been called the Steven Spielberg of sloth filmmaking. Which proves there's a niche for everybody in this world. Please welcome Lucy Cooke.
This is going to be a bit lighter and possibly even a bit more frivolous than what's gone before. But I think it's still, I believe really passionately about representing animals with truth and understanding animals for what they are and not what we want them to be, perhaps. There was a survey that was done in a Panamanian rainforest that found that a quarter of the mammalian biomass was actually made up of sloths. So that's like if you took all the mammals, you know, the tapirs, the rats, the ocelots, everything, a quarter of all of those would be sloths, which suggests that they're doing something really right. So, you know, perhaps rather than deriding the sloth for being different, we could actually look at it and try and learn from it. And I think we've got quite a lot to learn from sloths, because they are energy-saving icons. The reason why they have been on this planet for such a long time is that they are really good at conserving energy and just making do with what they have. They're the most mindful animals on the planet, in fact. The secret to their survival is their slothful nature. Their diet of leaves is very low in energy. It's also quite toxic. So they take a very long time to process it. It takes them up to a month to digest a single leaf. If they processed it any faster, they'd actually just, their liver couldn't cope and they'd poison themselves. So they're not lazy, they're busy digesting. And they are nature's couch potato. I'm proud of it. Their whole existence is based around using up as little energy as possible. And they have evolved some really spectacular. Here we see, look, they are snacking on a leaf, and they have these enormous, great big bellies in order to process all of those leaves. They can take up quite a lot of weight. One of the ways that they have a suite of ingenious adaptations to saving energy, and one of those is to have turned their lives upside down. Because if you're hanging from a tree, you only need 50% of the muscles that if you're propping up an upright existence. So sloths have sort of completely done away with extensor muscles like our triceps that hold your limbs stiff. Instead, they just have protractor muscles to pull them along. And they basically, they can do everything upside down. They can sleep, give birth, eat. They've got, their hair grows the opposite way so that they can drip dry after a tropical drenching. Their blood vessels can work against the force of gravity. And they've even got sticky bits on their ribs to stop that enormous stomach from crushing their lungs. So, you know, they can actually get away. They can survive on as little as 160 calories a day, which is about the same as well, I'd say a packet of crisps, because I'm English. You'd probably say a packet of chips, and it would probably be a lot bigger than 160 calories here. But yeah, but the only problem with having 50% muscle mass is that if you turn a sloth the other way up, gravity removes its dignity. And so they are literally, they crawl along the ground as if they're mountaineering on a flat surface, dragging themselves along. And you know, I think that's why the early explorers thought so poorly of them, because they were trying to think of them, they were thinking them out of context. They were turning them the right way up. Here you can see one that's been tethered to a tree in this medieval illustration. And that's the thing about animals. In order to understand them, you have to understand the context of their lives. And we have a terrible habit as humans of moralizing about animals. And I'm really fascinated by this. And I noticed that a lot of our moralizing about animals dates back to the bestiaries. And these were actually the first animal encyclopedias. And they were written in the Middle Ages. And they were hugely popular. So they had illustrations of animals, and then they had descriptions of habits of animals. But they were written by religious scribes, so they weren't intended to educate their audience about the habits of animals. Instead, they were looking for moral lessons that were hidden in animals' behavior. And animals tended to be either good or bad. To a certain extent, I think we still do this. You know, we have a newspaper in England called the Daily Mail. I think it's very popular here online as well. Oh, the Daily Mail loves a moral story about animals, and I you know, I find it really fascinating that this sort of this behaviour that we have dates back all this way. Elephants were good. And they were said to be the wisest of beasts. They were so wise, in fact, they had their own religion. They were incredibly patriotic, and they were said to, every time they thought about their homeland, would bring a tear to their eye. And they were completely averse to adultery. And so much so that if they were to catch any animal caught in flagranti, then they would kill them. Which would come as a surprise to most elephants, who enjoy a decidedly polyamorous love life. You know, one of the animals that didn't fare so well was the bat. This is taken from a 17th century bestiary written by a British clergyman called Edward Topsell. Edward was very, very, very concerned about bats. This was actually, his book was called The Fowls of Heaven. So it was the birds of heaven. He put these bats in the bird book. He didn't know where else to put them. They were flyy things, so let's put them in with the birds because they fly too. But he was very, very concerned by how, unlike the birds, bats had teeth and breasts, both of which were very, very troublesome to the clergyman. So he thought of all of these sort of like satanic comparisons of the bats. And you know, we still find bats. You know, there was a survey done recently by British Bat Trust, found that 1 in 5 British people hate bats. People think they're going to get stuck in their hair, that they're going to give them disease, and all sorts of other nonsense, which simply isn't true. The truth about bats is that they're incredibly helpful to us humans. First of all, well, you get microbats and megabats. The microbats are insectivores. They eat insects. So they eat insects that cause disease and threaten our crops and save us billions every year by doing that for free. And then they're also key pollinators for lots of plants, the mega bats, the fruit bats. This bat here is pollinating an agave flower and is one of the sole pollinators of agave. So you know what that means, don't you? It means that if there were no bats, there'd be no tequila. So whether or not that will be good for humanity is up for grabs. I'm not going to argue that one, the benefits of the wisdom of whether we need tequila or not. But certainly, you know, bats have been do us a lot of services. And if it wasn't for bats, we might not have ever invented sonar either. But their bad reputation has meant that we have abused them in the past. So this quote here is from a chap called Dr. Little Adams in 1941. The lowest form of animal life is the bat, associated in history with the underworld and regions of darkness and evil. Until now, reasons for its creation have remained unexplained. Well, Dr. Adams had an idea of what to do with bats and why they had been put on the planet. And he was this sort of maverick dentist from Pennsylvania who dabbled in invention. And he came up with an idea of how to bomb the Japanese by attaching tiny bombs to bats and then releasing thousands of them in Japan so that they would fly into people's houses and kill them while they were sleeping, was his cheery idea. What could possibly go wrong? Well, actually quite a lot, obviously. Amazingly, first of all, this project was actually green-lit. Because he had the ear of Eleanor Roosevelt. And so when the president read the proposal for this completely harebrained scheme, he approved it with the note saying, "This man is not a nut." This sounds like a perfectly wild idea, let's go for it. So for 2 years, this plan of action was attempted. There were some fairly vertiginous hurdles that needed to be jumped. First of all is the issue that at the time there wasn't a bomb that was smaller than a can of beans, which is quite hard for an animal the size of a mouse to carry. And then the second most crucial thing is that unlike other animals that have been conscripted for use in warfare, like dogs and porpoises and seals, bats can't be trained to follow orders at all. So basically what happened was that after 2 years of capturing thousands and thousands of bats and arming them with tiny weeny little bombs, they came to the practice day, and the way that the army, the US military, chose to try and control the bats in the absence of being able to train them was to use their biology. So they would put them in refrigerators and induce torpor so that they could control them. This was an imperfect solution, and when the first sort of training happened, so did this. A couple of bats went AWOL and flew off and blew up the entire base, the Carlsbad base. And to add insult to injury, because it was a top secret project, they couldn't call in any firefighters, and the military just had to stand around while their base went up in flames in front of them, because they couldn't share the secret. And then, so there you have, clearly, bats do not make a good idea for weaponry. Thank you very much.